So I think we're gonna wait a few minutes so the viewers can come in and not rush them a little bit.
That's good.
Okay, well, hello everybody for joining us for our youth talk about Canada 153 and Rethinking Canada Day. So in case, so Fridays for Future, in case you haven't heard our mission or the movement, our mission is to create a space for youth to advocate for a better world and for a future to recognize and implement Indigenous rights, uplift marginalized voices and communities, and follow principles of climate change. You can find us on Instagram at Fridays for Future, on Facebook, and you can email us at fridays4futureto at gmail.com. And you're welcome to ask questions and add comments in the YouTube chat. So today we are joined by a cricket guest who is an Indigenous Anishinaabe Métis, environmental justice activist, filmmaker. We are grateful to have you here today, and please follow her on Instagram at cricket.guest. We are also along Gabby and Amina as MCs.
So this week's weekly strike, we're going to be reflecting on Canada Day and how Canadians celebrate it. One thing to reflect on is if you really love Canada, then you want to see positive change here, and you're going to actively work on bettering the country and dismantling the systems of oppression. So a bit of history for Canada Day. Canada Day is the anniversary of the effective date of the Constitution Act of 1867. This act gave the federal government control over Indians and land reserved for Indians. Canada Day celebrates the creation of a country. On July 1st, 1867, Canada became a self-governing dominion of Great Britain. It has failed to recognize, however, that this nation was built on stolen land, and Indigenous people have been here long before.
Canada is also a state that owes its existence and prosperity to a colonial dominion over land and societies of its Indigenous peoples. This colonial dominance that has been part of Canada's past and present has allowed for social, political, economic injustices that systematically oppress Indigenous peoples.
So there's always been an erasure of history in Canada. So Canada Day is often a day that people celebrate the country's pride, freedom, and achievements. However, for many Indigenous people, it represents a dark history of genocide, oppression, theft, and violence that is too often erased when talking about the history of Canada. And without acknowledging the centuries of abuse and colonialization that Canada is founded upon, Canadians are actively turning a blind eye to the ongoing institutionalized marginalization of Indigenous communities and people.
So we wish to acknowledge this land on which we're holding an online rally. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We also acknowledge the privilege of online space that we have and the importance of using it to uplift voices and recognize the struggles that continue today of Indigenous people in Turtle Island. So, Cricket, how do you place yourself or reflect on what the land acknowledgement acknowledgement means to you.
Yeah, so I think land acknowledgements are incredibly important, of course, to know your traditional territory, or what traditional territory you are standing on, and what history that entails, because I mean, even just going off of like the theme of this call and like the conversation, a lot of what Canada aimed to do was to erase the Indigenous cultures that existed pre-Canada. And they did a pretty good job of that. And I'd say that most of the Canadian population doesn't know what land they live on. And I think that the land acknowledgements are a good way to make that more of a normal conversation to be having, and make that something that is regularly talked about, to acknowledge the people that came before, the people that pre-exist Canada, because even myself, like I was fortunate enough to grow up on my own traditional territory. I grew up on unceded Algonquin territory, and I think having that connection to the land is really important, and just like knowing where you come from, I think is really important.
Definitely. I also think it's extremely important to be grateful for the land that we're on, because we are settlers, at least majority of us, and sorry about that. To be thankful for all the land it has to offer us, and it sustains us, takes care of us, gives us clean air, clean water, so we want to take care of it and acknowledge the rightful owners of it. But we like to always ask these questions to go further, a further step on just land acknowledgements with what intentions do you have to disrupt and dismantle colonialism beyond this territorial acknowledgement? And this question is for speaker and our MCs, as well as the viewers, to reflect upon this question. So what are they doing, or actions they're taking to further the land acknowledgement? So I personally continually, like, being an ally is an action. You always have to support, respect, and listen Indigenous communities, and like push for the government to take responsibility in the past and present oppression that has been happening, because they have just brushed it off continuously throughout centuries, and an apology is the minimum they can do, and they haven't gotten it to take any action in the Truth and Reconciliation. So it just shows where their heart stands, that it's just talk, but no action has been taken. So we always want to pressure our representatives to do that, and continuously, nonstop. It's not something that we should do just on Canada Day, but every chance we get, and when voting, to be mindful of who is respecting Indigenous people and the environment. So if anybody would like to add their own personal, what they're doing furthermore to dismantle the colonialism.
I think I definitely encourage people, to vote and put pressure on the government, because obviously this is Indigenous land and we really do not pay, the government really does not pay a lot of attention to that. So I think voting is a very, very, very important part of that, whether it's federal or municipal. And definitely just uplifting Indigenous voices, making them be heard. And all of these past injustices, we really, really have to educate ourselves. Even if the school system sometimes fails us with that, we still have to continue to read books, watch movies, and really just do our research.
Along with educating our friends and family members, because if we notice, like, just to always be mindful that this is in our land, because a lot of people take it for granted and forget, or just put it aside, its history. So, yes.
Well, my intentions to disrupt, and I think those are very big words, and people get intimidated by them all the time, is like disrupt and dismantle colonialism, and people don't want to be associated with colonialism because they're like, I didn't do it. But the thing is, we're all part of this is, in everything we do, we're part of the system that continues to oppress or take away voices or take advantage of marginalized communities. So when you think of the Wet'suwet'en pipeline, or the pipeline going through Wet'suwet'en, unceded Wet'suwet'en territory, or when you think of different, like dams being built, or trying to dig up an area of another community's land, or I'm in Edmonton right now, so the neighborhoods here, some of the neighborhoods, they weren't from like actual and contract or negotiation with the Cree Indigenous communities here. It was through gradually pushing them out. So when I look at the neighborhoods, I'm also reflecting on how they came out to be. So my intentions here in this space is that after this call, I will continue to talk to family, talk to relatives, and continue to check myself. Because I think sometimes we can be, you know, too afraid to speak up because of the repercussions. But if we don't speak up now, the repercussions will be even greater. So I think that's how I approach it. But I'll kind of now bring back to a campaign that's happened. We all know that Canada Day happened on Wednesday. And Cricket Guest, who we're very happy to have here today, started this campaign, I'm Not Proud to Be Canadians. Canadians were called to reflect on their identity as Canadians and whether they were proud to support a nation that, and quoting Cricket here, only exists due to colonial grounds of Indigenous genocide, Black slavery, and a wide and deep array of other injustices. So, Cricket, could you tell us a bit more on the background of why you started this campaign and why it's important for people living on this land to reflect on their identities as Canadians?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's interesting, and I wanted to start this. I had the idea for the campaign amongst my own reflection of the Canadian identity and what it means to me, because I too was raised to celebrate Canada Day. Like I'm Indigenous, but I also have settler background. Obviously, I'm racially white, and my mom, she always celebrated Canada Day too, and that's just how she raised us. And it wasn't until I started to more radically reclaim my Indigenous identity that I started to contemplate what that celebration actually means. Because amongst Indigenous communities, the conversation of if we even are Canadian is something that is talked about, whether we identify as Canadian. So a lot of Indigenous communities and a lot of Indigenous people don't identify as Canadian. They don't adopt that title for themselves because our identities pre-exist Canada. The Anishinaabe were here before Canada. The Mohawk existed before Canada. And so so we don't define ourselves by the colonial era. And so then I started to think about how settlers aren't having this conversation. They're not really thinking about what it means to be Canadian in the same way that Indigenous people and Black people are forced to think about that, think about the history and why their people are here, and what that means for their people and the intergenerational trauma that comes with being Canadian. So that's why I started it. I ended up writing the poem, I'm Not Proud to Be a Canadian. And then I had the idea to do the campaign. And at the time, it was a radically different political climate. I feel like even within the past several months, the community, the activist community in Canada has actually just been very radicalized, and it's really cool to see. Because I remember when I had the idea for this campaign, I reflected on it, and I was kind of like, I don't know if any settlers would be willing to like hold a sign that says that they're not proud to be a Canadian and have that conversation, and have their face attached to it, because it was so new, and something that is very radical, and something that honestly angers people when they see. But then the Shut Down Canada movement happened, and then the BLM resurgence happened, and we see this like radicalization. We saw people challenging Canada in a way that I haven't seen in my lifetime. So it felt like a really perfect time to do it, as people were willing to start having those conversations and opening it up. Yeah, and it's been interesting, the reception, because it's had positive and negative feedback, of course, and it's interesting to see the discussions that are happening. I had some of the like most common comments that I get that are kind of like opposed to the campaign are like, well, if you don't like Canada, then just leave. And I'm like, well, this is my traditional territory. Like, my people have lived here for thousands and thousands of years, and Canada has only existed for 150. And I think people, when they think about Canada, it's so easy to forget just how young Canada is. Like 153, that is so young, that is a baby country. And Indigenous communities lived here for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And when you start to challenge the idea of the Canadian state, people get so scared, and they're like, oh, well, it can't change because, you know, it's our country, and like, there's no way it could change. And it's like, it's changed before, it can change again, like if we challenge it enough. Like, this was never always Canada, and it's only been Canada for an extremely tiny fraction of this land's existence. And I think these conversations are important because I don't think it will be possible to separate Canada from the genocide and the slavery that it is built upon.
I think for the viewers and us, like myself included, like it's important to recognize that it's okay to change sides, because every day we're learning more and we're evolving. Because when I was little, I never really thought about it, because the education about Indigenous people and the Canadian history, the history of this land, it's so poor and it's so one-sided. So that's why I feel like a lot of people get defensive, because it's like, oh, you're wrong. But in reality, it's like you haven't been properly educated. Like our educational system needs to change, because they have done better, but I only had one chapter in grade 10 about residential schools, and that's all I got, when there's so much more to it. And Canada's history, like this land's history, my bad, it starts way beyond 153 years ago. So definitely, I like that this movement started that conversation, because that's how it starts, being like, oh, but look at our side of things, because we have always been exposed, or like, I guess exposed, I don't know, to like one side of history. But it's really good to reflect on ourselves and be like, what is being Canadian? What are we really celebrating? Are we proud of this country? Like, because like they're lacking in a lot of things, like Indigenous justice, environmental. They're not an environmental leader, like how the world. My family's from Colombia. And when I tell them all these things, they're like, in Canada, really? Like, they don't expect it, because they put such a, I don't know the correct word, but like, we are the best, like no violence and all of these things, when it's a lie. And like, it makes it even worse that they're trying to cover it all up. And it's quite disrespectful. So definitely it's okay to evolve. And next Canada Day, and like, not even, don't wait for next Canada Day, but like every single day reflect on this land acknowledgement, that it's not ours, that it's, all of this was built on stolen land, and colonial system that is marginalizing and oppressing Indigenous people. So definitely it's something that people need to reflect upon, and hopefully they're open-minded about it and don't get so defensive on it, because I get they're proud for certain things, but like we need to hold the government and our country accountable pretty much.
Yeah, and I think that the pride, like, I understand it. Like, I don't even think that it's something that's not warranted, because people, like, we are literally brainwashed from the moment we're born to be proud of the country that we're from, no matter what country it is, or where, and who's to say you're not, but it's just so weird to me when you actually like take the time to reflect on nationalism in general and the blinded pride in your country. And Canada, like you said, has done a really good job at marketing itself as being this, like, it's just this like little fairy tale, like we have moose and snow and we're nice and we say A and we're like so quirky, and that's why, you know, a lot of it is like the poem is like imagery about like sweeping it under the rug, because that's the like illusion, but underneath it all is everything that this country was built upon. And people always want to compare Canada to the States. Anytime you mention anything wrong with Canada, it's like you automatically, they're like, well, at least it's not the States. And it's such a counterproductive conversation to even be talking about that, because like, yeah, sure, maybe in some ways, in some policies, Canada is more progressive than the States, but that doesn't mean that we're done. Like that we're nowhere close to being done. People always, within my circle, we always talk about how like Canada is nothing better than just America's like passive little brother, you know? Like we have the same injustices, but they're a bit more passive. Like we're a bit more they stab you in the back, but they do it with a smile on their face, whereas like America's a bit more blunt.
I was just gonna say one more thing, that I think it's so unfair to compare countries. I don't see the point at all. Like injustices were made in both Canada and the United States and a lot of other countries. But what's the point of comparing pain? Like whose pain, who are you to say whose pain was more difficult? Like definitely something not really okay to do.
Yeah, it's a form of gaslighting, honestly. I was saying to my friend the other day, actually on Canada Day, because people kept contrasting to the States. And it's like if somebody were in an abusive relationship and they were talking about their experience and trying to get help about that experience, and then somebody immediately comes at them with, well, at least you're not doing this, at least he's not doing this. Like I know somebody who did this who had this done to them by their boyfriend or whatever. And it's like, okay, well, their pain doesn't diminish my own, you know, by comparing Canada to the States and by being like, oh yeah, we had like gay marriage equality before the States did. That doesn't give clean drinking water to Indigenous communities. That doesn't take away the boil water advisories. That doesn't bring back all the missing and murdered Indigenous women by just comparing to the States. Like it's just such a weird way of people to deflect responsibility from holding their own government accountable.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And also, I think the part that resonated with me was 153, like we're still a baby country, and as fast as we went downhill, we can go uphill. So I hope that through this, people will be able to make solid commitments and push for more change. Now, can people still participate?
Yeah, absolutely. I've had a few people like DM me about that and being like, oh, can I still do it? And of course, most of us live in Canada all year. So this is a conversation that we should be having all year of what the Canadian identity means and how that relates to our government. Yeah, so yes, definitely people can still participate. I would love for people to still participate and to be having this conversation. Of course, Canada Day is the most obvious day to be reflecting on the Canadian identity and what it means to us and the pride in that. But of course, yeah, we should be reflecting on it all days, most days, and having those conversations. And I hope that this is just provoking people to start that conversation and that it doesn't finish with Canada Day, but rather just starts.
I think definitely, like we've mentioned, it's not just Indigenous people's job to acknowledge this dark history. I think since all of this kind of comes from these settlers, we also, like myself, we definitely have to learn about it a lot more. So as we've definitely acknowledged, there's a deep history of assimilation, displacement, criminalization of Indigenous peoples from taking land at gunpoint, residential schools, the 60s scoop, ongoing criminalization of land and water defenders. What role do you think environmental justice plays in correcting these wrongs?
I think, as a lot of environmental groups know at this point, is that environmentalism has like a long history of being pretty white-centered and like erasing Indigenous people, or like kind of pushing Indigenous people to the side, or like tokenizing them, and knowing that like the Indigenous people of whatever land you're on have a very crucial role in defending the land, and have in most cases, their communities have been doing this work for, once again, like hundreds, if not thousands of years. Like within the Anishinaabe teachings, you know, taking care of the land is so wrapped in our culture. Before we had to defend it, it was taking care of it. And so, yeah, it's just an extension of that. Land defending is just an extension of the caretaking that we were intended to do. And so I think that for environmental groups to be radicalizing themselves and to be starting the conversations of branching out just beyond like the conversation of environmentalism, and looking into how capitalism and racial injustices and how all of it is connected, colonialism, capitalism, the patriarchy, how all of it is so interconnected and they can't exist without each other, and that the abuse to the land is only a symptom of the abuse of people, it's all connected, like the abstracting of resources and missing and murdered Indigenous women, like those are so connected, you know. We always talk about how like the land is our mother, and she was the first stolen woman, you know. So I think it's important to be radicalizing the conversations amongst environmental groups, because a lot of them, I think, are afraid to be having those conversations, as they might seem a little bit too extreme. But for Indigenous communities, they're not extreme because we are forced to have those conversations and have those reflections, and we don't have a choice. So yeah, I'd say ease yourself, ease your friends into those conversations. Follow Indigenous activists, like follow Black activists, and just continue to like be educating and expanding your knowledge on how everything is interwoven.
And I think it's also important to recognize that not only did settlers steal this land, but they're also poisoning it constantly and killing it, and that ties a lot with it, like you were saying. But that they just continue going forward, and even after recognizing climate crisis as a national emergency and apologizing to Indigenous people, their actions don't show what they're saying whatsoever. But a lot of us, like in Canada Day, and also with the history of Canada, with planning this weekly strike, we were talking a little bit about confronting the notions that because our ancestors or we ourselves were born in a different country with less opportunities and lower quality of life, that we cannot cancel Canada Day, or that we owe Canada for all the opportunities it's given us. So how can immigrants confront this notion and rethink Canada? So I myself, I'm an immigrant. I came to this land 14 years ago. So my family and I are refugees. So coming here, I was like so grateful for Canada and all it's offered my family and I, like with the opportunities and a safe place to live it. So there's that part, but then we can't take that responsibility off, like ignore its history, because just because I'm not the one suffering in my own country doesn't mean like I come here and there's others. And it's our duty and personal responsibility to educate ourselves because the system or like educational system isn't doing it to put Canada's the best kind of face on, but to educate ourselves and to fight with Indigenous people. And we have to think like, because we were taught otherwise, like until grade 10, I didn't hear about residential schools. So growing up, our mindsets, like we said, we were a little bit brainwashed. And our parents, like my mom, doesn't know any of it, like because they don't get to be in grade 10 and be taught all of this. So it's our own responsibility to teach them. Because with my mom, and she's extremely proud to be Canadian, but you have to explain to them the reality of the country and all the injustices and the colonial system that we have benefited off it too. So that's why it's our responsibility to make it right, and to not just, because everything's fine with us personally, to just ignore all the oppression that's happening. So that's why it's really important to, even though I wasn't born here, I'm still taking my own responsibility, like we should be, in educating ourselves, supporting organizations and movements, Indigenous and Black communities, and decolonizing and getting the justice that they deserve. So that's my own personal reflection this Canada Day that I came to realize, because it was definitely like confusing. When you see all the facts, you like your eyes open up, because before they were just like, this is what they want you to know, so this is what's in your head, and there's nothing really for you to open up about. You're just like, oh, this is how things are done. But definitely important to constantly reflect and constantly fight with and support others.
I think to add on that as well, many people, when or if we're taught about Indigenous history, we really learn it more as like a start and finish. We learn a little bit about this really, really dark past, and then we're like, oh, we're past that now, but we really aren't, honestly. Like you said, everything really is connected. As well as what Salome said, whether or not, we moved here, we were born here, many people take celebrating Canada Day as just celebrating, I guess, all of its accomplishments, but really loving and being proud of your country is not just fighting for all those good parts, I guess, and that also ties into comparing Canada to other places. It's really wanting better for everybody in Canada, because even if we're personally not affected by some of these problems, many people in Canada are, and it's very not fair to just look at this one positive side and amplify it 100%. And it's not really taking away from it, I would say. But yeah, definitely just to keep in mind when we're celebrating, to really just remember where we're coming from, and remember that there are still people suffering and not getting their rights met, I'd say.
I'd like to add about the more recent immigrants and their relationship to Canada, and talking about this stuff, because I do think it's important, obviously, to acknowledge what we're talking about, how Canada and its history and the pride and whatnot. And I think I also just want to say that to work at your own pace, and just be gentle with yourself, especially if you're a racialized person, because if you're an immigrant and you're racialized, and I said this to almost a lot of my friends who are specifically brown, who had immigrated to Canada more recently, who wanted to participate, or I had reached out to them to possibly be part of the video, and I was like, please ensure your safety, because it's important to know that immigrants are targeted as well in different way, for being go back to your country, or you don't belong here, or the terrorist slur, or things like that. So I just also want to say, if anybody's feeling guilty about not wanting to, or not being able to participate, or not feeling feeling like scared to participate, that is absolutely okay. And that if you are especially a racialized person who experiences their own specific type of oppression and their specific type of like trauma in relation to the Canadian state, which that racism is innately related to Canada, and that's your own experience with the Canadian state, that you are completely allowed to take that time to have it internally. And it doesn't have to be so radical, and it doesn't have, or not radical, but it doesn't have to be so public, and it doesn't have to be like you holding a sign saying I'm not proud to be a Canadian if that feels dangerous to you. It can be more internal, and it can be just like easing into conversations with your family or your friends or just yourself, just reflecting on them for yourself. So I did just kind of want to talk about like that and the safety and making sure that people feel not pressured to have those conversations if they feel like it might be dangerous for them.
Definitely. I think myself, I'm really privileged, because when I was thinking about it all, and I was like, I'm so thankful that I'm a citizen, because if I was still a permanent resident without pending citizenship, it's really, especially when I first came here with Stephen Harper, he was like really harsh with immigrants. So my mom would tell me like, basically like to stay in line, don't jaywalk, not the smallest little things to give them an excuse to deport us. So I was thinking like, I'm thankful so I can like, I feel more free to express myself since I know I have that safety. But definitely watch out for yourselves, because the system's still broken, and it will take any excuse to be like, because especially with saying like, I'm not proud to be Canadian, and yet they're asking to be a citizen here, and they'll be like, it's definitely a confrontation and problem there. So I agree with what you were saying, to be careful. And I'm very grateful to like not feel like my voice was being, I couldn't speak up about it all, because it just kept coming to me like, and I bet there's a lot of refugees that are like, I have to keep my head down for now in order to be safe. Which is 100% like, first take care of yourself to make sure you're okay, you're safe. But once you feel stable and secure enough, if you can, to now take time to like, for those who are being oppressed or in a difficult time, to like lend lending hand. I don't know that expression very well, but because now they're the ones being silenced constantly, and you have that chance to amplify their voices.
I'm just gonna ask the next question here, and also I think this is one of the biggest, the previous question was one of the biggest questions in the way of how people are confronting themselves. And I think there's a lot of growth to be had and that people are having. So now we can talk a bit more about what concrete actions people can take. So what are some commitments we can make to amplify Indigenous voices and bring concrete action to bettering Indigenous communities? So Cricket, it's specifically like, are there things that you have in mind that people can do?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially like for the youth watching, just be like following Indigenous people, like be inviting Indigenous people into like your like space. And I mean that like just into like what you're consuming. Because a lot of us, like what we follow on Instagram, you know, that is what we're consuming, that is what we see, and that and like Indigenous people are like following them on Instagram or like whatever social media you use, TikTok, Twitter. There's a great community on all of those sites. So if you find that, you'll start to be more educated, and it's so much better to hear it from like real people that like you start to see like all the time, and you almost feel like it feels more close. Like it feels like the struggle is closer when you start to like follow these people and you see them all the time and you are hearing their voices and hearing their struggle, because yeah, it feels almost like a friend, and you don't want it, just like it starts to feel closer, and it also gives you more resources. Like if there's actions that you want to take part of rather, or protests or donations that are needed or bodies that are needed, art that might be needed, whatever your skill set is, like by following these accounts, especially within like your own community. So if you live in Toronto, following Toronto Indigenous activists like Alberta, Vancouver, etc. And just being aware of that, because I think like just like having the media at your disposal is important.
Yeah, most definitely. I was on TikTok for a while and then I went off it for security concerns. Um, but I think I learned so much from Indigenous, just like youth, normal youth living their everyday lives. Um, from like memes about powwows, and those are like really interesting to see. And hopefully after the pandemic I'll be able to attend one day. And from like the proper way to pronounce like Nunavut, I think. So that really resonated with me, like keeping them close and learning from them and forming those relationships. And I think that's when that care comes in. I also want to remind the audience that although Mayor Tory's motion passed for increasing the funding for police, that will again continue to target Indigenous, Black, colored bodies. Their work is still needed. This is not about the trend to defund the police, where everyone was kind of hopping on that for maybe a week. We need to continue the work. So if you see any posts, go reach out to those accounts, share their words, and provide that space.
I just also wanted to add about following Indigenous people and also Black people. Like it's an eye opening because you get to see their stories, their experiences, but you also get to amplify their voices by sharing on your story, just so other people that don't or are the word I'm thinking about is ignorant, but I don't want to use that word, but like are less aware or push it aside a lot of the time, just so you can be the link to them and be like, hey, look at what this person is going through, look at what they're saying. And hopefully that will spark something in them to be like, let me check this page out, let me read it, and then it starts there. Especially with our generation, it's all about social media. So that's how you can reach out to all the people that are following you, all your friends, and to slowly educate them and to push them a little and nudge in the right direction to being like, this is what is happening. This is what these people have to say. Injustice, ongoing injustices. So definitely really critical to follow Indigenous people and also just marginalized people in general to hear them out, see their experience, and to see how we can help, because they're the ones posting things like, oh, this rally or protest is happening, because that's where you find those resources. So when you're like thinking, I was like, oh, how can I help? You just follow them, and as soon as they're doing a movement, you support them, you join them, and you share it and educate other people, get other people to join you. And I honestly feel like that's how it starts, especially with like social media is a huge tool for that, and we should use it in the right way. Yes. But I was gonna say a little, like I follow numerous Indigenous individuals' accounts. First Nations photographer posted a statement regarding July 1st that they gave me permission to share. So I'm gonna read it out loud. Oh, 153 resistance. I definitely do not celebrate a birth that's felt like the death of many. The birth of this country has cost lives, languages, land, and so much more. the birth that can never bring back life. Human Indigenous lives that have been taken for generations, stolen, raped, murdered, without changes, and for years without question. Especially given that it was illegal for Indians to even access legal support. It was illegal for Indians to leave the reservation. It was illegal to hire Indians. It was pretty much illegal to be an Indian. Imagine being illegal on your own land, in your own home. But it's legal to cut down what not only gives us life, but the ocean and animal life too. It's legal to poison clean drinking water. It's legal to put profit before people. It's legal to kill Indigenous lives. I've lost count and had to set back from the number of Indigenous lives being lost to ones who are to protect us. So no matter what this country claims about protecting us, it can never protect us enough from itself, from its system, from the Queen, or from the illusion of dollars and their dreams. Sadly, all the money in the world can't fix us or save us. Only we can save us from ourselves, from them, and from it. In many ways, it feels like the death of their systems is the rebirth of ours, because reality is the birth of this country was never really the end, the death of us, like they visioned it to be. We continue to sing, dance, pray, play, and live in gratitude. So maybe if I'm to find something I'm grateful for every July 1st, it's always been our resilience. It's always been what this country has never been able to take, our spirit. Even though it still somehow wants what it's never had, but no amount of land, dollars, destruction, or control could ever give it what we've always had. Even with my eyes closed, even with my eyes covered, I still see you, #Kanata, for I was here long before you were born. Of course, I challenge you to #Rethink Canada, share #First Nation Resilience. So I found when I first read that, and I continue reading other posts, and it's just, when they're telling us how they feel, what they've experienced, and you can really also feel it too. So it makes you, when you follow all of these accounts, it makes you want to fight for them like it was your own community going through this. So that's why I think it's really important to connect yourself and to open up yourself to marginalized communities, to hear their voices, because that's how they're going to be heard. So very thankful for First Nations photographer for letting us share this.
Yeah. I've also, when I heard the statement or read the statement for the first time, I think the part that like in some way hurt the most was, even though I'm not part of the community, is that it can never protect us enough from itself. And I think that's the part where you have to, like, that's where you really start reflecting on every time you look away from a comment, or every time that something happens, how much hurt can be caused. And it's not like this one bad guy that people are trying to target. It's this big institution. Yeah. So now I'll give it to Gabby, who can
Yeah, before we finish up and stuff, we just want to share some resources to educate yourself, because even if you're not being educated by maybe parents or the school system, there are still options very, very much open to educate yourself. And also following Indigenous accounts, like we mentioned, is super duper important. So some of the ones we wanted to comment on were some, first of all, books. I completely apologize if I pronounced last names wrong, try my best, but these are really, really amazing resources. So Keeper's Me by Richard Wagamese is amazing. In Search of April Raintree by Beatrice Culleton, I'm so sorry. There's Something in the Water by Ian Dinnerl and Ellen Page. Active Defiance by a MacLeod. Podcasts include Missing and Murdered, Secret Life of Canada, Métis in Space. These are only some of the amazing sources that we can use to educate ourselves for our viewers and also just ourselves, because Canada Day is not the only day that we should be acknowledging Indigenous peoples on this land and educating ourselves about this. So we'd like to thank everybody for viewing, and thank you so much, Cricket, for joining us. Remember to follow her socials. And yeah, thank you just for joining us and having this discussion. We hope that you will be able to reflect on the commitments you've made and support initiatives that uplift and amplify Indigenous and marginalized voices.
So before we end off, Cricket, any last comments?
Thank you for having me on. I always love, I mean, usually I feel like when I do the Fridays for Future, like weekly strikes, it's in person. This is the first one I've done online, but it was cool to be a part of an online one for sure. Yeah, so thanks for having me. I hope this was somewhat beneficial and that people follow some cool Indigenous accounts after this. I'm sure a lot of people already are. Yeah, so miigwech for having me.
Bye, everyone.